light in the rain. 10 years ago, Louis Moreau, a young and ambitious architect, found himself at a crossroads in his life. His career had hit a wall, with rejected projects piling up and his self-confidence crumbling under the weight of failure. At the edge of despair, he received an unexpected lifeline, an invitation from Antoine Lefebvre, a close friend from university. Antoine had recently inherited a sprawling estate in rural Alsace, eastern France, from his late grandfather. He suggested that Louis take some time away from the city and use the solitude of the countryside to rediscover his creative spark. Desperate for a change of scenery, Louis accepted the offer without hesitation. When Louis arrived at the estate, he was struck by its grandeur and decay. The mansion, an imposing relic of the 19th century, stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by dense woods. Its weathered red-tiled roof and ivy-covered walls gave it an air of forlorn elegance. The windows, tall and arched, seemed to peer out at the world like watchful eyes, their glass dulled by years of neglect. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of dark corridors and high-ceilinged rooms. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through heavy velvet drapes. But what immediately caught Louis's attention was the curious presence of children's toys scattered throughout the house. Every room he entered seemed to have some relic of a forgotten childhood. A battered teddy bear on a mantelpiece, a wooden rocking horse in the corner, a stack of puzzle pieces strewn across a dusty table. Antoine shrugged off Louis's unease. "My grandfather was an eccentric collector," he explained. "He had a particular fondness for vintage toys. He said they reminded him of simpler times." Louis tried to accept the explanation, but something about the toys felt wrong, out of place, almost alive in the heavy silence of the house. That night, after unpacking in a modest guest room on the second floor, Louis lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house settling into the night. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. He was just beginning to drift off when he heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing on the wooden floor outside his door. He froze, straining to listen. The footsteps were light, almost like those of a child, and they paced back and forth just beyond the threshold. "Antoine," he called out, his voice breaking the stillness. The footsteps stopped abruptly, heart pounding. Louis got up and opened the door, only to find the hallway empty. Shaking his head, he muttered something about old houses and loose floorboards before shutting the door and locking it. The next morning, Louis found himself drawn to the grand library, a cavernous room lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. As he browsed the dusty tomes, he noticed a small, weathered music box on a side table. Intrigued, he wound it up. The box played a hauntingly beautiful lullaby, its melody achingly familiar yet unsettling. When the music stopped, Louis felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He turned to find a doll sitting on the armchair opposite him. It was an old porcelain doll, dressed in a faded blue dress, its glassy eyes fixed on him. Louis was certain the chair had been empty when he entered the room. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences multiplied. A toy car would appear in the middle of the hallway, though Louis hadn't touched it. The rocking horse in the sitting room would sway gently on its own, as if an unseen child were riding it. One morning, Louis woke to find his bedside table covered in crayon scribbles that spelled out his name. One particularly stormy night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, Louis was jolted awake by a sound that sent shivers down his spine. The unmistakable laughter of children. It was soft and melodic, yet it carried an edge of malice that made his skin crawl. He sat up in bed, his heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight he kept on his nightstand. The laughter seemed to come from the room across the hall. Summoning his courage, Lewis stepped into the dark hallway and crossed to the other room. Pushing the door open, he found the room empty save for a pile of toys in the center of the floor. A single, flickering candle sat atop a small table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. As Lewis stepped closer, the shadows seemed to twist and contort into grotesque, childlike figures. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. The next morning, shaken by the night's events, Lewis confronted Antoine. Over a breakfast of stale bread and black coffee, Antoine finally revealed the truth. "My grandfather wasn't just a collector," Antoine admitted, his voice low and hesitant. "He was obsessed with the occult. He lost his only son, my uncle, when he was a child. Afterward, he became consumed by the idea of bringing him back. The toys, the rituals, they were all part of his attempt to create a home where his son's spirit could return." Lewis stared at Antoine in disbelief. "Are you saying this house is haunted?" Antoine sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but whatever my grandfather did, it left a mark. Some say he succeeded, but not in the way he intended." The final days of Lewis's stay were a descent into madness. The toys seemed to take on a life of their own. A wooden soldier marched across the floor as Lewis watched in horror. The rocking horse in the sitting room began to creak rhythmically, though no one was near it. And always, there was the laughter, soft and mocking, coming from the shadows. One night, Lewis woke to find his bed surrounded by dolls. They stood in a perfect circle, their unblinking eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. Trembling, he tried to push them aside, but they toppled over as if resisting his touch. He stumbled out of the room, only to find the hallway filled with the same porcelain dolls, their faces eerily identical. The breaking point came on his last night in the house. Lewis awoke to the sensation of being watched. At the foot of his bed stood a small figure, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It looked like a little girl, dressed in a white nightgown. "Who are you?" Lewis whispered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and as it stepped into the light, Lewis saw its face. It was a ghastly parody of a child's face. Its eyes were black, empty voids, and its mouth stretched into a grin far too wide to be human. Lewis screamed and bolted from the room, not stopping until he was outside the house. He climbed into his car and drove away, never looking back. As he sped down the gravel driveway, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the little girl standing at the window, watching him leave. Now a successful architect, Lewis rarely speaks of his time at the estate. He has never returned to Alsace and has lost touch with Antoine. Yet, the memories linger. Sometimes, when he walks past a toy store, he feels a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as though unseen eyes are watching him. And in his quietest moments, when the world around him is still, he can still hear the faint, haunting melody of the music box and the echo of children's laughter. Shadows in Briarwood Hall. Ethan Hart had always been a skeptic, the older twin of Aaron Hart. Ethan had spent his life dismissing anything remotely supernatural, while Aaron loved ghost stories and tales of the paranormal. Ethan prided himself on his logical mindset and scientific outlook. However, one horrifying experience during his university years at Whitmore College in Vermont would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew. In his second year, Ethan moved into Briarwood Hall, an old dormitory notorious for its unsettling history. formerly a luxurious hotel in the 1930s. It had been repurposed as student housing decades later. Its once grand exterior was now weathered, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and cracked windows that whistled in the wind. Inside, the narrow hallways and dim lighting added to the building's eerie ambience. Ethan shared a room on the third floor with his roommate, Liam Price, a cheerful business major with a penchant for late-night gaming. The room was cozy but old-fashioned, with mismatched furniture and a small en-suite bathroom. The vintage charm of Briarwood was something Liam found fascinating. But Ethan couldn't help but notice how every creak of the floorboards or flicker of the lights seemed oddly amplified in their room. "I love this place," Liam said one evening as they unpacked. "Feels like it has character." "You know," Ethan smirked. "Character, or it's falling apart." Liam laughed. "Maybe both. But hey, if you see any ghosts, let me know. We'll make a viral video." Ethan rolled his eyes. "I'll let you know when I find a haunted chair." About 6 weeks into the semester, Ethan had his first disturbing experience. It was a cold October night, and the wind howled outside, rattling the dorm's ancient windows. Around 3 a.m., Ethan woke suddenly, unsure of what had roused him. The room was silent except for Liam's soft snoring. As Ethan's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed something unusual. A tall, shadowy figure was standing near Liam's desk. The figure's shape was vague but unmistakable. It had the same build as Liam, and for a moment, Ethan assumed his roommate was up late working on something. "Liam," Ethan whispered, his voice hushed in the stillness. "What are you doing?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned slowly and began moving toward the bathroom, its movements unnaturally fluid. Ethan frowned, confused by Liam's silence. He glanced at Liam's bed and froze. Liam was still there, sound asleep, his head buried under his blanket. Heart pounding, Ethan turned back toward the shadow, but it was already slipping into the bathroom. The door creaked shut, and then nothing. No sound of footsteps, no running water, just an oppressive silence. Gathering his courage, Ethan got up and cautiously approached the bathroom. He pushed the door open, bracing himself for what he might find. The bathroom was empty. The next morning, Ethan tried to laugh off the incident. "Probably just my imagination," he told Liam over breakfast. "I was half asleep. Maybe it was a shadow or something." Liam raised an eyebrow. "A shadow that moves into the bathroom? Creepy. Man, you should have woken me up." Ethan shrugged, brushing it off. But deep down, the memory lingered. No matter how much he rationalized it, the image of the shadow's deliberate movements haunted him. Weeks passed without incident, and Ethan started to believe it had all been a dream. But one freezing November night, the shadow returned. Ethan woke again in the middle of the night, this time with an overwhelming sense of unease. The figure was there, standing in the corner near Liam's desk. Unlike before, it seemed to emit a faint glow, a single, piercing red eye that flickered like a dying ember. The eye blinked once, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The shadow moved toward the bathroom, its red eye glowing brighter as it passed Ethan's bed. It didn't make a sound, but the air grew colder with each step it took. Ethan stayed frozen, his body paralyzed with fear, as the shadow slipped into the bathroom and disappeared. When the first light of dawn broke, Ethan made a decision. "I'm moving out," he told Liam. "I don't know what's going on in here, but I can't stay." As Ethan packed his belongings over the next few days, Liam seemed unusually quiet. Finally, one evening, he broke his silence. "Look, there's something I should probably tell you," Liam said, hesitating. It's been bugging me since you first mentioned the shadow." Ethan stopped packing and turned to him. "What is it?" "A few weeks before you saw anything," Liam began. "I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. I looked up at the mirror, and, for a second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me. It was just a flash, a man in a dark suit. Maybe, but when I turned around, there was no one there." Ethan stared at him, his stomach tightening. "Why didn't you say anything?" Liam shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "I thought it was just my imagination, but now, I'm not so sure." Ethan moved out of Briarwood Hall the next week, transferring to a modern dorm on the other side of campus. He never saw the shadow again, but the experience left a lasting mark on him. Once a staunch skeptic, he now found himself questioning his beliefs about the supernatural. Years later, Ethan still avoided talking about his time in Briarwood Hall. The memories of those nights, the shadowy figure, the glowing red eye, and the oppressive silence were things he couldn't forget. While he still didn't claim to understand what had happened, he now approached the unknown with a sense of respect and caution. The silent companions. For as long as I can remember, strange things have followed me. Small scratches appear on my skin, thin, faint, but chillingly unexplainable. I have no pets, and I don't keep long nails. Yet these marks seem to arrive as if by some unseen hand. My family thinks I'm clumsy or that I exaggerate, but I know the truth. These scratches are just one part of a much larger mystery. For ghosts reside in the house I currently live in, but one of them has been with me my entire life. It doesn't matter where I go. Whether it's across town or across countries, he follows me, always watching from the shadows. The first time I saw him, I was just a child. I was 5 years old, living in a modest home in Crestwood, Virginia. My father, a career military officer, was preparing to take me to school. While he went to fetch my backpack, I sat by the large bay window in the living room, watching the leaves fall in the morning breeze. That's when I saw him for the first time. He stood just outside the window, a young man, no older than 18. His curly black hair framed a face that was both sorrowful and curious. His deep brown eyes seemed to look right through me, and his dark coat hung loosely around his slim frame. He looked Latino, though I couldn't be sure. I stared at him, too frightened to move. He didn't do anything but stand there, watching me. The moment my father walked back into the room, the man vanished. When I told my father about him, he seemed uneasy but told me it was probably a trick of the light. Yet, his hesitant expression hinted he might believe me, at least partially. From that day forward, the man was always there. No matter where we moved, whether it was Arizona, Texas, or even Germany during my father's deployment, he followed. First, he was a vague shadow, a fleeting glimpse in the corner of my eye. But as I grew older, his presence became more defined. By the time I turned 16, I could see him more clearly. He no longer hid in the periphery but would stand at a distance, watching silently. At times, I almost grew accustomed to him. He never hurt me, after all, at least not directly. But as his visits became more frequent, they also became more intrusive. When I turned 20, I moved out on my own, hoping to leave the strange occurrences behind. Yet, he followed me even there. The house I live in now, a quaint colonial-style home in Wilmington, Delaware, has its own share of ghosts. There's an older man, an African-American gentleman who looks to be in his 40s, dressed in early 19th century clothing. Then there's the timid young woman in her 20s, always wearing a long nightgown. Her sad, anxious face suggests a troubled past. And finally, there's a boy, no older than 12, dressed in a style reminiscent of the 1920s, with suspenders and a flat cap. The three ghosts are quiet, keeping mostly to themselves. They're almost like part of the background, occasional presences that you feel but don't fear. But the man in the black coat is different. He commands their attention in a way I've never seen before. One afternoon, I came home from school to find all four of them standing in the living room. The older man leaned casually against the wall, his arms crossed, while the young woman hovered nervously by the fireplace. The boy stood closer to the man in the black coat, who was in the center of the room. They weren't speaking, but it was clear they were interacting in some way. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't describe. When they noticed me, all four turned to look at me simultaneously. Their expressions weren't hostile, but the intensity of their gazes made me freeze in place, unable to handle the overwhelming sensation. I bolted out of the house and ran to a nearby park. The park was deserted when I arrived. I made my way to the swing set and sat on the last swing in the row, trying to calm my racing heart. The small pond by the slide shimmered under the fading sunlight, and the air was still. As I stared at the pond, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, something caught my attention. The swings beside me, for empty seats, suddenly twisted around their chains as though an unseen force had wrapped them tightly around the metal bars. There was no wind, no one else nearby who could have done it. I sat frozen, unable to move or even scream. The sight of those swings swaying unnaturally in the still air is a memory that haunts me to this day. By far, the most terrifying encounters happen at night. I've always been afraid of the dark, so I rarely sleep without at least a small lamp on. But some nights, I muster the courage to turn it off, only to regret it moments later. On those nights, I can feel him lying beside me. The mattress dips slightly, and a cold sensation brushes against my arm. It feels like a presence heavy with sorrow, pressing into my space. I've cried myself hoarse, screaming for my siblings to come and save me. But every time they enter the room, the sensation vanishes as if it were never there. Recently, I've noticed thin scratches appearing just above my lips, between my nose and upper lip. They sting at first but heal quickly, leaving no scars. I've also heard faint sobbing coming from the closet while putting my younger sister to sleep. The sound is faint, almost like a whimper, but it's enough to send chills down my spine. One night, while locking up the house, I saw something unusual, a soft, white light flickering outside near the driveway. First, I thought it was headlights, but when I looked closer, it seemed to take the shape of a person. The light hovered for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Despite everything, the man in the black coat remains a mystery. Who is he? Why does he follow me? And what is his connection to the other ghosts in my house? I've tried researching the history of my home and the surrounding area, but nothing explains the peculiar combination of spirits or their strange behavior. If anyone reading this has experienced something similar, I'd love to hear your story. I've spent years feeling isolated and misunderstood, but I know I'm not alone. Somewhere out there, someone must have the answers I'm looking for, or at least the courage to ask the same questions. The mystery of Hawthorne Manor. 7 months ago, I moved to the quiet town of Hawthorne Ridge, nestled in the lush hills of Vermont. As a newly appointed history and English teacher at the local high school, I was eager to embrace the charm of small-town life. I moved into a sprawling colonial-style house on the outskirts of town, sharing it with two fellow first-year teachers, David and Claire. The house, known as Hawthorne Manor, was nothing short of breathtaking. Built in the late 1800s by a wealthy merchant family, it boasted wide verandas, French doors, and stained glass windows depicting scenes of rural America. Each pane of glass was an intricate tapestry, portraying wildflowers, deer, and songbirds native to Vermont. Despite its beauty, the house carried an air of mystery, as if it were quietly guarding its secrets. Initially, life at Hawthorne Manor was uneventful. The creaks of old floorboards and the groans of settling timber were easy to dismiss. However, about 3 months into our stay, things began to change. One evening, while preparing lesson plans in my room, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but when I turned toward the reflection in the glass door of my bookshelf, I froze. A tall man in an old-fashioned coat stood just beyond the doorway, his face shadowed and his posture unnervingly still. My heart raced as I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light and went back to work. But that night, I dreamt of the man, his hollow eyes staring at me as he stood at the foot of my bed. The experiences weren't confined to me. David, ever the skeptic, initially dismissed my stories as stress or overactive imagination. However, his confidence wavered after an incident in the kitchen. Late one night, he went downstairs for a glass of water. As he reached for a glass, he noticed the faint sound of someone humming. Turning toward the source, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a young woman in a damp, Victorian-style dress standing near the pantry. Before he could say a word, she vanished. Claire, on the other hand, was more open to the idea of hauntings. A week after David's encounter, she heard faint laughter coming from the attic. Thinking it might be one of us playing a prank, she climbed the narrow stairs only to find the attic empty. She described the laughter as soft, almost childlike, and said it seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Other oddities soon followed, puddles of water appearing inexplicably on the floor, faint whispers in the dead of night, and the subtle scent of lavender wafting through the halls despite no flowers being in the house. The most chilling encounter came on a rainy November evening. I returned home late from a parent-teacher meeting, the house eerily quiet. As I stepped into the kitchen to grab a snack, I saw her, a young woman, no older than 20, stood near the sink. Her long, dark hair clung to her face as if it were wet, and her dress, clearly from another era, was soaked. Her back was turned to me, and she seemed to be weeping softly. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. She turned slightly, just enough for me to see her profile. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her lips trembled as though she were about to speak. Before she could, she vanished, leaving only the faint scent of lavender behind. Determined to uncover the truth about the house, I visited the Hawthorne Ridge Historical Society. There, I met Mr. Grantham, an elderly historian who had lived in the town his entire life. Over tea, he recounted the tragic history of Hawthorne Manor. The house had been built by Jonathan Hawthorne, a successful merchant, for his wife Margaret and their 3 children. However, their lives were marred by misfortune. The 2 sons, Charles and Edward, died during the Civil War. Their daughter, Elizabeth, drowned in a nearby river during a storm. Consumed by grief, Jonathan spent his final years in seclusion, passing away in the very house he had built for his family. After learning the house's history, everything started to make sense. The man in the coat was likely Jonathan Hawthorne, eternally mourning his losses. The young woman in the kitchen was Elizabeth, forever trapped in the moment of her untimely death. The whispers, laughter, and lavender scent were echoes of the past, bleeding into the present, while the spirits of Hawthorne Manor were unsettling. They didn't seem malevolent, Over time, we adapted to their presence, treating them as part of the house's character. David began to leave a glass of water on the kitchen counter every night, a quiet acknowledgement of Elizabeth. Claire started lighting lavender-scented candles in the living room, believing it might bring the spirits some comfort. One snowy evening, as I graded papers by the fireplace, I heard footsteps in the hallway, expecting it to be David or Claire. I looked up, but no one was there. Moments later, I heard the faint murmur of voices coming from the parlor. Curious, I approached the doorway and peeked inside. What I saw made me stop in my tracks. The ghosts of Hawthorne Manor were gathered in the room. Jonathan sat in an old armchair, his face etched with sorrow. Elizabeth stood by the window, her hands clasped as she gazed out into the snowy night. Two young men, presumably Charles and Edward, stood near the fireplace, engaged in quiet conversation. For a moment, they seemed so real, so alive, that I almost forgot they were spirits. Then Jonathan looked up and met my gaze. His expression was one of profound sadness, yet there was no anger or malice. Slowly, one by one, they faded, leaving the room empty once more. The longer we stayed in Hawthorne Manor, the more we came to understand its ghosts. They weren't trapped by rage or unfinished business, but by the weight of their grief. The house wasn't just their prison, it was their refuge, a place where they could exist together despite their tragedies. One night, as I prepared to leave Hawthorne Manor for good, a new job opportunity had come up in a nearby town. I sat by the fireplace one last time. As I stared into the flames, I felt a presence beside me. Looking up, I saw Jonathan standing there, his gaze solemn but kind. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Before I could respond, he was gone. Living in Hawthorne Manor was a transformative experience. The spirits that once terrified me became a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of love and loss. While I may never fully understand the mysteries of the house, I'll always carry with me the lessons it taught me, that the past and present are not as separate as we like to think, and that some places hold onto their stories for a reason. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, exploring these mysterious and spine-chilling stories. If these tales have sparked your curiosity or left you with unforgettable feelings, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had similar paranormal experiences that you'd like to share, feel free to send your story to the email address provided in the description. Who knows? Your story might become part of our journey into the spiritual world in a future episode. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting tales. See you in the next episode, and remember, always keep a light by your side.